Now, Democratic Congressman from New York, Jerry Nadler. He's the chair of the House Judiciary Committee. What do you make of these revelations from your perch chairing that committee, Congressman?
Well, I listened very carefully to Nick Ackerman, and it certainly seems very indicative. I think the walls are closing in on the president. The proof is beginning to be assembled of a vast conspiracy to defraud the American people with several different aspects, whether it was the hush money to the women that the president seems to have been personally involved in, or this collusion with Russians in which they're given data in which the people who gave it to them from the Trump campaign knew had no value to them other than to help them micro-target social media, illegal social media interventions in the American election, and of course the Trump Tower meeting relating to the hacks from the DNC. This is why it is so important to protect the Mueller investigation and to make sure that that report that may or may not be coming out soon becomes public and is not pocketed by Mr. Whitaker or Mr. Barr. And that's what we have to make sure of. It's one of the things we have to make sure of on the Judiciary Committee, that report is public so that the American people know the results of this investigation. And of course, we have work to do also. We now have enough leads to do our own investigation on some of the things that Mueller probably knows already, but hasn't said yet.
So on the publicness, this is something I've been asking a lot of folks. The regulations at issue do not require that it be made public. You're saying you view it as your job to make it public. Do you have that power as the committee chair to do so?
Well, the committee certainly has the power to subpoena the report, and if necessary, we have the power to certainly invite former prosecutor Mueller to testify in front of the committee and ask him about it.
You're saying once he were to finish, if the executive attempted to essentially keep it under wraps, those are two avenues you have the power to pursue.
That's exactly right.
Now, there's reporting about Steve Mnuchin, who's someone that I know that various committees of oversight have been pursuing, particularly as relates to the decision to lift sort of walk back sanctions on Oleg Deripaska, a man at the sort of center of all this. And he has now agreed to give a classified briefing tomorrow. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what's the nature of that?
Well, I don't know what the nature is. It's a classified briefing to all members of the House as to why he is proposing to remove or removing these sanctions. Now, these sanctions were imposed on Deripaska and other Russian oligarchs close to Putin because of the invasion of Ukraine, of Crimea, the occupation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine. And of course, we know from everything you've talked about, we know from the testimony about the Trump Tower meeting, that the chief quid pro quo for all of this help to the Trump campaign from the Russians is the lifting of sanctions. They've wanted to do that from day one, and now we see. Now the president, of course, tried to delay the imposition of sanctions that Congress voted, and Congress forced him to impose them. And now he's trying to lift sanctions without the Russians doing anything to remove themselves from the Crimea or stopping their aggressions in Ukraine. So why you would lift the sanctions except as a quid pro quo for illegal help in the election by the Russians, I wouldn't know.
And presumably the Treasury Secretary will speak to that in a classified briefing tomorrow. Another item that just broke in the last hour is a story from the Washington Post about the beefed-up legal team inside the White House and their strategy sort of aggressively to assert executive privilege in matters having to do with the investigations of Robert Mueller. Is your committee staff prepared for what can be some extremely high-stakes legal battles between these two branches of government?
Our committee staff and the House counsel, who was just hired last week, are very much prepared for whatever legal battles may be necessary. And the fact of the matter is, Richard Nixon tried to assert executive privilege, and the Supreme Court very sharply slapped him down. There is no reasonable case for executive privilege. Executive privilege is always pierced by any reasonable necessity in a criminal or congressional investigation. And the Nixon case, which was a unanimous Supreme Court, made that point very clear.
All right, Congressman and Chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler, thank you very much.